Within The Bear Season 4, I had two favourite episodes. One was episode 4, which was all about Sydney and time standing still for the first time, and one was episode 7, the episode which felt like it was Fish's 2.0. The family were back together for the wedding of Tiff and Frank, and it felt like Richie was due to implode, and we'd get a repeat of what happened during the Christmas dinner of Season 2 episode 6. However, what we got instead was a powerful piece of television that included all of the same characters as Fish's, apart from Mike, the one that was no longer around. And it brought to light the core theme of this season: togetherness, family, and how the dysfunctionality between the Berzattos was the very thing that allowed them to get through even the most difficult of times. So with that, let's discuss The Bear Season 4 Episode 7 and why it was perfect. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The dynamic of Richie and Frank. All throughout Season 4 of the show, in fact, do you know what, even before then, we saw the dynamic of Richie feeling like he was losing his family to Frank, something that was at the core of his character arc. He originally lost the love of his life, Tiff, to Frank, and he felt as though he was losing his daughter, the most important person in his life to whom he deemed as a stranger. In the opening scene, we saw that Richie was stressed, and the build-up of all of the thoughts that he'd been having about Frank were at the forefront of his mind, making him almost not go into the house, and it seemed like if he did go in there, it was going to be pure chaos. He'd constantly built up in his head and viewed Frank as this villain and somebody who he hated for the loss that he was essentially suffering. But what we saw throughout this episode, and most importantly, what Richie saw, was that Frank was just human. We saw that whilst Richie struggled due to feeling like he was living in the shadow of Frank in the eyes of his daughter, Frank also felt as though he was living in the shadow of Richie, not being able to live up to being as good of a father as what he was, and knowing that he'd always be second best when it came to Ava. This was all served to us through the use of Ava refusing to come out from under the table due to not wanting to dance, and it taking the entirety of the family being under there discussing their fears to be what allowed her to get out of there. However, even though it was done for Ava, it was just as much for Richie without him even realizing. Richie seeing Frank as human and no longer fearing the man that was in front of him due to realizing that the love that his daughter had for him wasn't going to change was a moment where a weight almost got lifted off of Richie's shoulders. Whilst it felt like the scene where they were all under the table was carried out for the purpose of Ava, like I said, what it actually served as was a way for Richie to see that even though he felt alone, like he lacked purpose and like he didn't have a family, something that we actually saw him mourning when he catered for the family in episode 3 and also when Carmy was holding Sophie. This actually highlighted to him that everybody under that table was a part of his family, and he was singularly connected to each and every one of them. He used the metaphor of the rocks in the photo that he had representing the different families and how he didn't feel as though he was a rock because he didn't have a core family. But what this made him realize was that he was the sand that lay underneath them, which meant that he was actually the person that connected all of the families together, and that was very much the case. Whether it be Tiff and her new family, the Berzattos, the Franks, or the staff at the Bear, Richie was a part of all of them, and he was a valuable member. With him also dancing with Tiff at the end of the episode, it showed that he'd fully moved on, and that he was no longer going to be held up on her. That moment actually made me feel quite emotional. Tiff was the love of his life, and he was dancing with her at her wedding to another man. With her also being in tears, you could tell that she was feeling a sense of happiness in the sense that he'd finally accepted her relationship with him and that he was ready to move on. What I loved about the end of this episode was the fact that Richie ended the night in his apartment all alone, a place where we normally see him wallowing in that emptiness that he has. But in this instance, we saw the complete opposite. He grabbed a beer and then looked at the photo that Fax sent through of the family that he was a part of, and all he could do was smile from ear to ear, showing that he was fully comfortable with the situation that he was now in and understanding the different families that he was a part of, showing that he was happy. This was actually the first time that he'd smiled in the entirety of the season, so it marked a true change within him. The episode made us think that it would mirror Fish's. One thing that this episode did a really good job at was making us believe that it was building towards an explosion just like Fish's did in Season 2 Episode 6. However, whilst utilising the same characters and moments, it showed the complete opposite, and it actually highlighted how people can change through time, and that the family had actually moved on a lot since Carmy was last at a family gathering. For example, we had the scene in the bed, we had the scene between Unc and Richie, we had Richie panicking and stressing outside like the beginning of Fishes, we had Lee back in the picture, and we had Carmy fretting about being around his mother. All moments that could have ended in a complete disaster. And with Claire and Stevie talking and gossiping about how a Berzatto gathering always ended up having some kind of drama, it really did lead us astray. However, with Donna off the booze and leaving early, Lee and Carmy reminiscing about Mike rather than arguing over him, and Unc actually asking Richie if he was doing okay. The levels of hostility that we were being teased with were never truly met, and instead what we got was a scene under the table where we saw the value of family togetherness and how the dysfunctional nature of them all being together in some capacity, even though they weren't all truly related, was what complemented the situations that they found themselves in, and together they were able to operate. Even though the episode didn't mirror Fishes in terms of the explosive nature that it had to offer, in terms of an emotional payoff, it matched what we got in Fishes, but on the other end of the spectrum. Rather than us being left with the family arguing with each other and Carmy just looking out into the distance, questioning the family that he was in, we got all of the family dancing with one another, being happy with themselves, and Richie looking out at the family that he's a part of and truly understanding his place within it. Something that he didn't know before, so there was still that emotional payoff. Once a bear, always a bear. This was a powerful moment in the episode for me because we saw two different sides to this once a bear, always a bear motto. We saw Tiff speaking with Unc and saying how she originally feared that she was going to lose the family that she inherited by being married to Richie once she divorced him. And this was because she didn't really have a solid family of her own, as we saw with most of them not actually attending her wedding with Frank. This was met with Jimmy saying to her that they were never going to let her go because once you become a bear, you always stay as one. So here in this instance, we had somebody who was a part of the family fearing that they were going to be ostracized, but it was never going to happen. But then on the other side, we had Sydney's first true introduction to the family and her first time at a Berzatto-dominated event, even meeting Donna, which showed that she was now fully a part of the bear family, even having a space under the table. In the following episode, that was when she called up Shapiro and mentioned how she wasn't going to be going into business with him. So it simply showed what being a part of that family can do and the influence that it has, as even with the business struggling and barely staying afloat at the end of the season, it was the family element and the human connections that kept everybody together. The sense of love, togetherness, and progression of relationships was at the heart of this episode, and through the use of Richie and Frank, Ted and Kelly, Francie and Sugar, Carmy and Lee, and also Carmy and Claire, it was a beautiful episode that was shot in a way which felt like it was predominantly close-ups of characters' faces so that we truly felt a part of the intimate conversations that were occurring. I'd say that this was definitely my favourite episode in the season, and even though it wasn't Fishes, it was the closest thing it could be to it, whilst also being the farthest thing apart from an emotional perspective. So, there you have it, why The Bear Season 4 Episode 7 is perfect. If you want to see a full breakdown of The Bear Season 4, then check the video below. I've also broken down Season 2 and Season 3 of the show, so if you want to see those videos, they'll be there as well. Was this your favourite episode? Share your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.